Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here at the Center for Strategic and International Studies on this Martin Luther Day King holiday to talk to Tom Karako, who is the man, the myth, the legend on all things missile defense here at CSIS. Good to see you again. Happy New Year. And for anybody who needs proof, you're the hardest working man in show business.
Always good to be with you.
Absolute pleasure. Tom, big missile defense review. We've been waiting for it for 2 years. Finally got dropped last week. I know that you wrote a very thoughtful piece on it, which can be found on the CSIS website. Talk to us a little bit about, very, very lengthy, very long on sort of what has to happen, but perhaps maybe a little bit short on specifics and what's new. Give us your sense on what you thought as one of the most thoughtful people on missile defense in Washington.
I would say that the expectations were high in the sense that the task that the Missile Defense Review needed to accomplish, above all, was to take the big pivot, the big change from the national defense strategy, from rogue regimes and counterterrorism, and move towards great power conflict. And the task of the Missile Defense Review was to take our past missile defense posture, which has been very much oriented towards rogue regimes, and begin to orient it to high-level aerial and missile threats. And what I would say is that this review begins to do that. It's a first step. It's a good start. Doesn't quite get to all the things that you're going to have to do, but in some respects, that's no surprise. The Joint Force has taken air superiority for granted for way too long, and it's going to take a little while for us to catch up.
But there were those who look at the review, and it was very comprehensive, right? I mean, the description of the threats facing the nation and the international community was very, very fulsome. On the other hand, there was not as much discussion, for example, on the air side of the threat. A lot of it was very missile defense focused, and ballistic missile defense focused more particularly. From your standpoint as somebody who clearly the group talked to, and you've talked in public about the process and as it was going through. As you see the future environment, how would you describe it, right? I mean, if you had been the author and spearheading this, and it was spearheaded by John Rood, the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, certainly a very, very thoughtful mind sitting in the policy seat there with both, administration and defense expertise, but also industry expertise. I mean, he worked for Lockheed Martin in the international role for a number of years. If you were the one who was crafting this, how would you have crafted it? What are the priorities you would have set? And sort of, how would you have crafted the document?
Yeah, well, first of all, I have to commend Undersecretary Rood and his team. The task here was a big one. This was a big apple to eat in one bite, and so there's a lot going on here whenever you're looking at every aerial threat from mud to space. So lots going on there. You're absolutely right. The threat spectrum is much more difficult now. It's everything from UAVs to cruise missiles to hypersonic glide vehicles, and of course your redoubtable Scuds and ballistic missiles of the past. You're also right that in terms of its actual recommendations, at least in the near term, the priority is still a lot of the program of record. But I think it's promising that the review does open the aperture, not merely to look at non-ballistic threats. In a way, we were kind of already doing that for cruise missile defense for the capital region and things like that. But I think sort of at the level of policy and at the level of theory, it opens the door and opens the aperture to doing a lot more. And it's going to take a little while for that to sink in because, again, the services have kind of taken, at least on land, have taken air superiority for granted for way too long. And so looking at the specter of complex integrated attack, the combination of UAVs with ballistic missiles, with all this kind of stuff, that's not theoretical anymore. Everybody knows that the U.S. monopoly on the precision strike complex is no longer a monopoly, number one. And number two, you've seen it, not in theory, but you've seen it in Ukraine and Syria and, frankly, the Yemen missile war. The combination and the lethal and sophisticated combination of all of these different things together, that's what we're going to have to do, and we're still going to have to do a lot more, again, on the aerial side, like you say, to make our air and missile defenses more survivable and resilient against that broader threat.
Talk a little bit about the Yemen conflict, because there are folks who see some of the things that, whether it was the Taliban, whether it's ISIS and how drones have been used with explosives on them. A lot of folks don't focus on the sophistication of the Yemen war and how drones have played a role in that. Talk to us a little bit about what and how the Houthis have managed to use unmanned aerial vehicles to affect, certainly, against the Saudi-led coalition.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you brought that up. We've been tracking the Yemen missile war since it kind of began in spring of 2015, so that was 4 years ago. And you can find a tracking of what's available public source on our website. But look, the Houthis brag about using UAVs to target the Patriot radars that the Saudis and the Emiratis have. That's what they're saying. So you take a look at that. You look at the fact that the North Koreans are flying UAVs down to surveil the THAAD ballistic missile defense system in South Korea. If that's what North Koreans and the Houthis, maybe with a little help, if that's what they're able to do, then you think about what Russia and China can do, and it's going to be an order of magnitude or two greater. And in fact, you don't have to speculate, because again, that's what the Russians have been doing in places like Ukraine, using UAVs to surveil and then call in an artillery strike with lethal effect in short order, or similarly in Syria. So we're going to have to do a lot more, especially in terms of force protection, low-tier stuff. I think the review lays down some very good theoretical markers, policy markers, really, that in terms of the programs and the 2020 budget and beyond, hopefully that will get some more texture.
One of the criticisms of the report is that it's too China-focused, that it doesn't have as much of a focus on Russia. And, whereas China does have to be a significant focus for U.S. forces, right? I mean, there are some folks who justify the departure from Syria, Afghanistan, and elsewhere as, hey, let's focus our attention on the China problem, which is a bigger issue. But the Russians have shown positively eye-watering anti-access area denial capabilities of their own as they try to project force over the entire Baltic, up into the Arctic zone, in fact, from just Kaliningrad. Talk a little bit in a discriminated fashion about sort of the Russia threat and what that constitutes. As you mentioned, there's also Iran and North Korea, right, in this axis, and we also know that the terrorist groups have access to the same technology. Talk to us a little bit about how the Russia and China air defense and A2AD challenges are both similar but also very different from a strategic planning standpoint.
Right. So the national security strategy said that the United States would continue to pursue missile defenses, but with an eye to strategic stability. That phrase doesn't appear in the missile defense review, but what it does say explicitly is that the United States will continue to rely on deterrence, on nuclear deterrence, in terms of deterring Russian and Chinese ICBM attacks, very specific ICBM attacks. But when it comes to, and maybe intercontinental range, hypersonic boost glide vehicles, things like that, we are going to be pursuing some active counters. That's all for the good. And so in the past, we've had very much a bifurcated missile defense thing, kind of Samson pushing away two different things, Russia and China over here, and rogue state active missile defenses over here. They're moving together a little bit, but still keeping some fair distance. So we're still going to rely on deterrence, retaliation for ICBM attacks, major attack, but I think the report is absolutely on point to say we do need active defenses to raise the threshold for attack for the regional or trans-regional ballistic, cruise, anti-ship, all these sorts of things. We need that active and passive counters for our forward deployed forces and everything else. That's how a conflict could get started in the first place in some region. And so by doing that, by putting those counters in, it raises the threshold for attack and contributes to our overall deterrence and defense goals.
Let's talk hypersonics for a second. Hypersonic glide vehicles, the Russians claim they're already there. The Chinese aren't very far behind. We as Americans always like to think that we've got a bead and we're sort of have a lead, but if you look at it, we've been working on railguns for a very long time. It's the Chinese that get bragging rights now because they've deployed a railgun, for example, for the first time at sea on one of their ships, or getting ready to do so. If we believe what they have to say about it, there is a sense that some of that is a little bit more optical than not. Let's talk about the hypersonics space. It looks like our adversaries are moving very, very fast. In fact, faster maybe than some folks had anticipated that they will. where do you see the state of plays of the regarding defenses against hypersonic systems? Because folks are talking about lasers and railguns, whereas neither the laser nor the railgun that we would use for these applications is anywhere near prime time to take care of a threat that is, you know, and you've got your own countermeasures, right? Burn through is a little bit of a challenge because some of these vehicles have ablatives on them anyway, where, you know, focused laser, you know, walk us through the kind of concerted national strategy there has to be. And I think Mike Griffin over in the Pentagon deserves a lot of credit. This is something that he's hammering nonstop on to drum up awareness as well as defenses.
Right. Look, in the beginning, there was air defense.
That was almost biblical right there.
Well, and it's a long story, okay? It's a long epic here. In the beginning, there was air defense, and for a long time, we were looking at active counters to just about every fixed wing, rudder, whatever that could come at us. And then we kind of got cocky, and we took air superiority for granted, and so we really divested from a lot of things. The services divested, and then we kind of see these new threats like hypersonic glide vehicles come up, and you know, look, hypersonic is just an adjective. It just means goes fast. Okay, it's faster than 5 times the speed of sound. Lots of things are hypersonic. Space shuttle's hypersonic. ICBM reentry vehicles are hypersonic. That's not the point. The point is it's maneuverable. It's a maneuvering air threat, very fast, but across the spectrum. And I think that's the way to think about it, is we have to have the sensors and the effectors, and probably, look, we're going to be doing kinetic on kinetic for a very long time in the air and missile defense world, across the board, from the counter UAVs kind of stuff to the counter cruise missiles. And so in some respects, I was a little surprised there wasn't more meat on the bone for the lower tier air defense stuff. All good, all praise due the department for talking about the counter hypersonic thing. That has to be done, but it's really the full spectrum. And so, you know, look, it's I mentioned a moment ago the sensors and shooters. All good on them for making, and this is really the single most significant muscle movement in the review, is to say, yeah, we are going to go to a space sensor layer. Good, you got to do that. You have to have a space sensor layer for these things that kind of hug the Earth, high atmosphere, because if you can't see them, you can't go get them. Now you're going to have to figure out how to go get them. Probably it's kinetic for the reasons you said before, lots of different reasons. But it's that space sensor layer. Now guess what? You also need sensors, overhead elevated sensors for a bunch of other aerial threats. And, you know, look, back in our we taking air superiority for granted days and before the return of history, we got out of the elevated sensor business. You remember the J-Lens thing from a couple years ago? Look, whatever the solution is, whatever the platform, whatever the maker, I don't care, but you're going to have those elevated sensors, not just for the boost glide, but also for the cruise missiles of a variety of sorts. So the report points to the kind of 3-phase program that we're kind of already doing on cruise missile defense. Probably want to do a little bit more on that too, and so I look forward to the 2020 budget and other activities to really, again, put some more meat on the bones of how we're going to prosecute that.
Last administration, and a lot of this plan is predicated on what the last administration started, right? I mean, it's the continuation of things that began before. And I know that there's a lot of classified work that's going into counter hypersonic systems. But right now, from what's publicly available, what are our capabilities to defeat systems like this, given that almost none of the systems that we have in service now were designed for this specific kind of a threat?
Right. So, look, we've been doing the missile defense mission now for 20 years in this kind of respect. I mean, look, it's been going on for longer than that, too. But since the late 1990s, when Congress and other folks kind of said, look, let's figure this out. We've been focused mainly on the ballistic mission. Like some counters are multi-purpose, such as Standard Missile 6 or PAC-3, Patriot. Some are, to some extent. But things like THAAD and GMD, purely ballistic. And it's not just the interceptor, it's also the sensor architecture that goes with it. Look in one direction, you assume you can predict exactly where the threat's going to be. And not to beat a dead horse here, but it's going to be, in the first instance, the sensor. It's going to be much more robust, much more elevated, looking at things that can come from behind, to kill you from behind. So that has to be reiterated. And yes, the effectors, kinetic and non-kinetic, but maybe it's taking things off the shelf and adapting them. Some of these airframes are pretty impressive. Perhaps they can be adapted. On the other hand, we may need to build a few more. And I again give a lot of credit to Undersecretary Griffin and his team for making this, as he says, his top priority. And so, look, they're awarding big contracts on the offensive hypersonic strike side, but look, it's going to be important to maintain the momentum on the counter hypersonic side. So I think, the offensive is getting a lot of the attention and the love and the contracts. We want to make sure that the counter side gets a lot too.
Two more questions. One, what's the role and how important and what time horizon should we look at lasers and railguns? A lot of progress is being made on railguns. There isn't the barrel degradation issue, for example, we used to see for a long time, so you can get a lot of power, cycle it very quickly. A whole bunch of commercial technologies are helping us sort of get there, from power storage and other things. Walk us through the role, because I think sometimes folks, my whole career has been the laser is right around the corner, the railgun is right around the corner, and neither of them have been really right around the corner, or as close as we've thought they will be. What do you see as the state of the art, and what is the reasonable time horizon before we start to operationalize stuff like this? Obviously, we're using it as counter-drone. USS Ponce took Art Zabrowski's laser, who was the head of the Office of Force Transformation. The Navy at the time didn't want to do it, and he ramrodded it through, and the Navy ended up picking it up and using that system. But walk us through that piece of the ecosystem.
Yeah, in some ways, we've been 5 years away from lasers for the missile defense mission for the last 30 years. And yet in other respects, we can be a little glib about that, but in other respects, look, it's already here. The Army and these other folks they have lasers that are small enough and powerful enough to do especially the counter-UAS mission. And again, props to the Army for their combat functional team that's looking at putting...
The cross-functional team, the CFT, the guys at Force... Futures Command, sorry.
Yeah, right. And they're looking at directed energy to put on a truck for really the counter UAS mission. They've already got the lasers that are small enough and powerful enough to do that. Getting it operational, as you say, and getting out in the field and building units and institutionalizing this, that'll take a little bit longer. Having said that, I think that directed energy kind of needs its Desert Storm moment. In Desert Storm, they took air defenses, Patriots, that weren't built for the ballistic missile defense job, just threw it out to see what it could do. There's lots of disputes about the exact record, but we know that this can be done. Airborne lasers shot down stuff in 2009, and so at the next opportunity, the first chance we get to use these things in combat to again capture the imagination and test it out in that way, that would be all for the better. And then likewise with the railguns. Look, we've heard lots of folks talk publicly. Vince Sabio here a little bit ago talk about different kinds of hypervelocity guns and things like that. That's pretty terminal defense, but surely that has to have a role as well.
And obviously one of the reasons, I think most of our audience knows this, but you're on the wrong side of the cost exchange equation if a guy is producing $250,000 missiles like DF-21 or DF-26, or a couple of $100,000, and you're using multi-million-dollar interceptors to shoot them down. I mean, even for some of these shorter range systems, it's $80,000 a shot, which is okay against boutique sort of mortar attacks and things like that, but not anything against a great power who's going to be raining. They're building thousands of missiles for a reason, right?
But I think, I tend to dislike that formulation. Okay. And I think that doesn't quite do justice. It's kind of an old-fashioned way of putting it. But if you are really...
Sorry, I was trying to channel my inner Andy Marshall there.
Yeah, but I mean, it's kind of the NHTSA criteria from the 80s. But let me go back to the fundamentals that are laid out in the report. We're still going to rely upon deterrence. And so it's not about necessarily the thousands, maybe the hundreds, but it's about introducing enough uncertainty and enough counters to raise a threshold. So they can't do it with a small number. They're going to have to go at least in a larger sense. And so it's about contributing to the overall deterrence and defense goals. What's the problem you're trying to solve? If you're trying to have a perfect shield for the continental United States, that's one thing. But if you're trying to have some no-kidding active and passive measures for your carrier group and your bases and all this sort of stuff, yes, we need to have more capabilities than what we do today and greater numbers and all that. But frankly, it's not so infeasible as the thousands upon thousands might lead you to believe.
So, raise the threshold. So if you are rogue or you're just going to shoot a couple of missiles, whether you're in North Korea or Iran, hey, I'm going to shoot that down and then I'm going to wallop you using my other strategic means.
Everything else that the United States can bring to bear. And look, that's a pretty important hook that this review puts in place is that strategic logic. It's about introducing uncertainty and raising the threshold so that every single day, China, Russia, whomever, thinks this is a bad day to attack on, even at the lower end, so-called. And so therefore, it really contributes to the overall political, the alliances, everything else that the United States wants to do in the world.
And that goes also for Russia and China, right? Even if you come at us with a barrage, we'll stop that first barrage, and then you're going to have to deal with whatever we're going to unleash on you. So you don't want that bad day.
Right. And so it's deterrence by retaliation, but also mixed with a little bit of deterrence by denial.
And let me ask you one last question. So what's next, right? Now that this much anticipated, much vaunted report is now out, what are going to be the next steps here? Because the administration has, I think, rightfully said, this is an important challenge. We saw from the North Koreans, the North Korean capability, and you guys have done a terrific job on tracking that. Thank you for all the time in the past on that as well. What are we going to expect next from the administration in terms of pushing this ball forward?
Right. Well, by my count, I think there's about 12 taskers that the report actually stitched in italics letters that are assigned to different offices, different institutions. I think there's 12 of them that are due either 6 months from the report's release, so that would be, I think, July 17, or in a couple cases, 9 months, so I guess that's October. So there are some decisions to be made, things that folks anticipated might be in the report, such as a site selection for an East Coast site, should they decide to go there, and institutional and acquisition stuff. Lots of other things that 6 months from now, 9 months from now, we may be talking about.
Tom Karako, the man who watches missile defense here at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Tom, thanks very much. Really appreciate it and look forward to having you back on as we continue to update this important topic. Thank you.
Always a pleasure. Thank you.